Imagine a scholar who lived for only 45 years, and yet left behind a body of work so beloved that it has been read in nearly every mosque and household of his faith for almost 800 years since. Imagine a young man who gave up the ordinary comforts of life, who never married, who never sought wealth or position, who lived on little more than bread, and who poured the whole of his short life into a single thing: the love of sacred knowledge. Imagine a man so devoted to learning that, by the accounts, he would study many lessons every single day, walking the streets of his city with a book in his hand, unwilling to waste a single hour of his brief time on earth. Imagine a scholar so humble that he came from a modest, unknown family with no famous ancestors and no inherited advantage, and who rose, through nothing but his own devotion and discipline, to become one of the most trusted and beloved teachers his tradition has ever produced. Imagine a man who, despite his gentleness and his quiet ways, did not fear to speak the truth even to the most powerful ruler of his age, when justice demanded it. Imagine a life so short by the measure of years, and so vast by the measure of what it gave, that we are still drinking, 8 centuries later, from the wells that he dug. This is the story of such a man. His name was Yahya, and he is remembered by the world as Imam al Nawawi, after the small town where he was born. He lived more than 700 years ago, in the 13th century, in the land of Syria, in an age of great danger and great learning. He was not a conqueror, nor a ruler, nor a man of wealth or worldly power. He was simply a scholar, a student and a teacher of the sacred sciences, who gave his whole brief life to knowledge and to God. And in giving it, he left behind a gift that has outlasted empires. We will follow his whole life tonight, slowly and gently, from his birth in a humble town to his years of intense study in the great city of Damascus, through his life of remarkable discipline and simplicity, his courage before the powerful, and the great works he wrote, to his early death and the legacy that has endured for centuries. It is a story about devotion, about the willingness to give up everything lesser for the sake of something greater, about how much a single short life can accomplish when it is poured, without reserve, into one worthy thing. And through it all runs a quiet question, gentle and enduring. What might we do with our own brief time, if we gave ourselves as completely as he did to the thing we most love? So settle in, and let your mind grow calm. There is no hurry here. We have a long and peaceful journey ahead, through a distant world and a single remarkable life. You do not need to remember every name or every date. You only need to rest, and to listen, and to let this old story carry you gently toward sleep. Wherever you are, however tired you feel, you are welcome here. Let the cares of the day grow quiet, and let us travel back together to a world that is more than 700 years old. Perhaps you have felt, in some quiet moment, the thing that lay at the center of this man's life, the wish to give yourself fully to something worthy, to not waste the brief time you are given, to pour your days into what truly matters rather than letting them slip away unspent. Al-Nawawi lived that wish more completely than almost anyone. He knew, though he could not have known how short his life would be, that time was precious and not to be wasted, and he used every hour of his brief span with an intensity that still astonishes those who learn of it. There is a quiet inspiration in keeping company, as the night settles, with a man who so refused to waste the gift of his days. So as we begin the long walk back through his life, carry no burden of effort. You are not being asked to study or to remember. You are being invited to rest, and to let an old and true story unfold at its own unhurried pace. The way a quiet evening deepens slowly into night, we will move gently, and there is nothing you need to do but listen, and let the calm of it settle over you like a blanket drawn up in the dark. To understand the man, we must first understand the world that made him. We must travel back to the 13th century, to the land of Syria, in one of the most turbulent and frightening ages that the Muslim world had yet known. For this was the age of the great Mongol invasions, when armies swept out of the distant east, conquering and destroying as they came, toppling kingdoms that had stood for centuries. It was an age in which the very heart of the Muslim world was shaken, when its greatest city was destroyed and its old order overturned, when many believed they were witnessing the end of their civilization itself. And yet, in the midst of all this danger and destruction, the life of learning went on. This is one of the remarkable things about that age, and about the people who lived through it. Even as armies marched and cities fell, the scholars continued their patient work, teaching and studying and preserving the knowledge that had been handed down to them. In the city of Damascus, which became a great refuge and center of learning in those troubled times, the schools remained full, the study circles continued, the sacred sciences were taught and learned as they had been for generations. It was as if the love of knowledge was a light that even the darkness of that age could not put out. Damascus, in particular, rose to great importance in this period. It was an ancient city, one of the oldest continuously inhabited places on earth, and it had long been a center of faith and learning. But in the 13th century, as other centers fell or faltered, Damascus became one of the foremost cities of the Muslim world, a gathering place for scholars, a city full of schools and mosques and libraries. To come to Damascus as a student in those days was to come to one of the very best places on earth to learn, a place where dozens of great teachers could be found, where the sacred sciences were studied at the highest level, where a devoted young seeker could find everything he needed to grow into a master. This was also an age, we should note, in which the rulers and the scholars existed in a delicate relationship. The rulers of the time, the sultans and their officials, held the worldly power, commanding armies and governing lands. But the scholars held a different kind of authority, a moral and religious authority, and the people looked to them for guidance. A wise ruler valued the support of the scholars, and a courageous scholar might, at times, stand before a ruler and call him to justice. This relationship between worldly power and moral authority would play its own part in al-Nawawi's story, for he would become a man who, despite his gentleness, did not hesitate to speak the truth to the most powerful. This, then, was the world into which he came, an age of great danger, when the Muslim world was shaken by invasion and many feared for its very survival, and yet an age in which the love of learning burned on, and in which the city of Damascus rose to become a great refuge of knowledge. Into this world a child was born, in a humble town, who would give his whole short life to that burning love of knowledge, and would leave behind works that have outlasted all the dangers and empires of his age. So let us leave the wide world behind now, and turn toward a small and humble town, near the great city, where a child was born, who would become one of the most beloved scholars his faith has ever known. Let us linger a while longer in that frightening and remarkable age, for the more clearly we see it, the more astonishing al-Nawawi's quiet life of scholarship appears against its backdrop. The 13th century was, for the Muslim world, one of the most catastrophic periods in its history. From the distant steppes of the east came the Mongol armies, vast and terrible, sweeping across the lands of Asia with a speed and a ferocity that seemed, to those who faced them, almost beyond human. Kingdom after kingdom fell before them. Cities that had stood for centuries were destroyed. Whole populations were scattered or slain. The greatest blow of all came in the middle of the century, when the Mongol armies reached the very heart of the Muslim world and destroyed its most storied city, the great capital that had been, for 500 years, the center of the faith's learning and power. The destruction of that city sent a shock through the entire Muslim world, a wound so deep that many believed they were witnessing the end of their civilization. The old order, which had endured for centuries, seemed to be collapsing. It was an age of fear, of uncertainty, of grief, an age in which the very survival of the faith and its learning seemed in doubt. And yet, here is the remarkable thing, the thing that should fill us with a kind of wonder. In the midst of all this catastrophe, the life of learning did not stop. The scholars did not abandon their books. The schools did not close their doors. Even as the world seemed to be falling apart around them, the patient work of teaching and studying and preserving knowledge went on. It was as if the scholars understood that their work was more important than ever precisely because of the danger, that in a time when so much was being destroyed, the preservation of knowledge was a sacred duty that could not be set aside. Damascus became, in this period, one of the great refuges of this surviving learning. As other centers fell or weakened, the ancient city rose to new prominence, drawing scholars and students who sought a place where the sacred sciences could still be pursued. The city filled with the learned, its schools multiplied, its study circles flourished. It became, in a dangerous age, a kind of fortress of knowledge, a place where the light of learning was kept burning while darkness threatened all around. To come to Damascus to study, as the young al Nawawi did, was to come to a place that had become precious beyond measure, a guardian of the tradition in a time of peril, something deeply moving lives in this, and deeply instructive. It shows us that the love of knowledge can be stronger than fear, that the patient work of preserving and passing on what is precious can continue even in the darkest times. The scholars of that age could not stop the Mongol armies. They could not save the cities that fell, but they could keep their tradition alive, could continue to teach and learn and preserve, could ensure that even if much was destroyed, the knowledge itself would not be lost. And in this quiet, patient work, they performed a service to their civilization as great, in its way, as any victory on the battlefield. Al-Nawawi was a child of this age and this spirit. He grew up in the shadow of the Mongol terror, in a world that had been shaken to its foundations, and his response, like that of the best scholars of his age, was not despair but devotion, not paralysis but patient work. He gave himself to the preservation and the teaching of knowledge with an intensity that the dangers of his age may have only sharpened. If the world was uncertain, if life was fragile, if civilization itself seemed under threat, then all the more reason to give oneself completely to what was lasting and precious, to the knowledge that could outlive the empires and the armies. His whole disciplined, devoted life can be seen as one scholar's answer to a dangerous age, to build in the midst of destruction something that would last. The town was called Nawa, a modest place in the fertile plains to the south of Damascus, in the land of Syria. It was not a famous town, nor a center of learning, nor a place from which great scholars were expected to come. It was an ordinary provincial town of farmers and traders and ordinary families, and it was here, in the year 1233, that the child who would become Imam al Nawawi was born, and given the name Yahya. His family, by the accounts, was a modest one. They were not wealthy, nor famous, nor known for producing great scholars. There is very little recorded about his father and his relatives, which itself tells us something, that they were ordinary people, of no particular renown. But his father, it is said, was known for being pious and God-fearing, a man of genuine faith, if not of worldly distinction. And so the boy Yahya grew up in a household of simple, sincere devotion, in an unremarkable town, with nothing in his circumstances to suggest the heights he would one day reach. Whatever greatness he would achieve, he would owe to nothing but his own gifts and his own devotion, and to the grace of God. He had no famous name to open doors for him, no inherited wealth to ease his path. He had only himself, and his love of knowledge. There is a beloved story told of his childhood, one that captures, even in his earliest years, the quality of soul that would define him. It is said that when he was a boy of about 10, playing was the natural occupation of children his age, and the other boys would call him to join their games. But the young Yahya, it is told, would turn away from the games and toward his books, preferring to recite the sacred text and to study rather than to play. He was not drawn to the ordinary amusements of childhood, but to something deeper, even then. We tell such a story gently, as a beloved tradition treasured by those who loved him, without insisting on its every detail. But it points to something real, something that all the accounts of his life confirm. That here was a soul drawn, from its earliest days, toward knowledge and devotion with an intensity far beyond the ordinary. It is said that a man who noticed the boy's unusual devotion to his studies recognized that here was something special, and encouraged the boy's father to nurture his son's love of learning. And so, in time, it was decided that the gifted boy should be given the chance to pursue the knowledge he so clearly craved. This was no small thing for a modest family from an ordinary town. To send a son away to study in the great city was a sacrifice, and a sign of how clearly the boy's gifts had been recognized. But the path of knowledge was opening before him, and he would walk it with a devotion that few have ever matched. When he was about 18 years old, around the year 1251, the young Yahya came to Damascus, the great city of learning, to begin his serious studies. We can imagine what this meant for a young man from a humble provincial town, arriving in one of the foremost cities of the world, full of scholars and schools and the bustle of a great center of knowledge. He took up residence in one of the city's schools, a place called al-Rawahiyya, where students of the sacred sciences lived and studied. And here, in this school, his extraordinary life of learning truly began. There is something poignant in imagining that departure from home, the young man leaving the only world he had known, the green plains of Nawa, the modest house of his pious family, to set out for the distant city. Such departures are among the quiet turning points of many lives, the moment when a person leaves behind the familiar and the safe to pursue something they cannot yet fully see, drawn forward by a longing stronger than their fear. The young Yahya could not have known what lay ahead, what heights he would reach, how short his life would be, how lasting his influence. He knew only that the path of knowledge called him, and that he must follow it, wherever it led. And so he left his home, and walked the road to Damascus, and stepped into the life for which he had been made. Many of us have known, in our own way, such a moment of departure, the leaving behind of the familiar for the sake of something we feel called toward. And there is a quiet companionship in remembering that the great ones, too, once stood where we have stood, at the threshold of an unknown future, and stepped forward in trust. The accounts of how he lived in those student years are remarkable, and they reveal the depth of his devotion. He lived, by the reports, in the simplest possible way, on little more than bread, denying himself the comforts and pleasures that most people take for granted. He gave himself wholly to his studies, with an intensity that astonished even his teachers. It is said that he would study many lessons each day, more than a dozen by some accounts, in different sciences, going from teacher to teacher, subject to subject, drinking in knowledge with an unquenchable thirst. He did not waste his time in idle pursuits or comfortable diversions. Every hour was given to learning, to reading, to memorizing, to understanding. There is a detail told of these years that captures his devotion perfectly. It is said that he was so unwilling to waste any moment that even as he walked through the streets, going from one lesson to another, he would have a book in his hand, reading and reviewing as he went, refusing to let even the minutes of a walk pass unused. Whether or not every such detail is exact, the picture they paint is consistent and clear. A young man utterly devoted to knowledge, who treated time as the precious and fleeting thing it is, and who was determined to fill his with as much learning as it could possibly hold. And he was blessed, in Damascus, with an abundance of great teachers. The city was full of masters of the sacred sciences, and the young al-Nawawi studied under a great many of them, more than 20 by the accounts, learning the law, the traditions of the Prophet, the interpretation of Scripture, the Arabic language, and all the sciences that a great scholar of his age was expected to master. He absorbed the vast inheritance of learning that Damascus had to offer, and his remarkable memory and his tireless devotion allowed him to master it with a speed and a depth that set him apart from his fellow students. The humble boy from the unknown town was becoming, through nothing but his own labor and devotion, one of the great scholars of his age. A certain tenderness comes with imagining those early years in Nawa, before the world had heard his name, and they are worth dwelling on, for they remind us how unlikely his greatness was. Nawa was an ordinary town, a place of farmers and ordinary families, set in the fertile plains south of the great city. Nothing about it marked it as the birthplace of a scholar whose works would be read for centuries. It was the kind of place that history usually passes by, a small provincial town like thousands of others, where ordinary people lived ordinary lives, and his family was as ordinary as the town. They were not wealthy, they were not famous, they had no tradition of scholarship, no great name, no inherited advantages to pass to their son. The records tell us almost nothing about his father and his relatives, and this silence itself is telling, for it shows that they were not people of note, not the kind of family whose doings were recorded. They were simple, modest people, of no particular distinction. The one thing remembered about his father is that he was pious and God-fearing, a man of genuine faith. And that, perhaps, was the most important inheritance the boy received, not wealth or status, but a household of sincere devotion. We should let the unlikeliness of this sink in, for it is part of what makes his story so inspiring. Here was a boy with every disadvantage, in worldly terms. He was born in an obscure town, to a modest family, with no famous name to open doors, no wealth to ease his path, no scholarly tradition to guide him. By the ordinary logic of the world, such a boy might have been expected to live and die in obscurity, an ordinary person in an ordinary town, unremembered by history. Instead, he became one of the most beloved and influential scholars his faith has ever produced. And he did this through nothing but his own gifts and his own devotion, and the grace of God. His story is a powerful reminder that greatness is not reserved for those born to advantage, that a sincere and devoted soul can rise from the humblest beginnings to bless the world. The beloved story of his childhood, of how he turned from the games of the other children toward his books and his recitation of the sacred text, deserves a closer look, for whether or not it happened in exactly the way it is told, it captures something true about the boy he was. The heart of the story is a child who was different, who was drawn to something deeper than the ordinary pleasures of childhood, whose soul reached, even in its earliest years, toward knowledge and toward God. It is the kind of story that gathers around the childhood of great souls, treasured by those who love them because it shows the greatness present from the beginning. But we should be careful not to misunderstand it. The story is not meant to suggest that there was something cold or joyless about the boy, that he could not play or had no childhood happiness. Rather, it points to the unusual intensity of his inclination toward knowledge, the way that learning and devotion were, for him, not a duty imposed from outside, but a genuine love, a deep desire of his own heart. He turned to his books not because he was forced to, but because he wanted to, because the things of knowledge and faith drew him more powerfully than the games of his playmates. This is the mark of a true vocation, a calling that comes from within, and al Nawawi seems to have felt it from his earliest years. It is said that his unusual devotion was noticed by someone who recognized its significance, who saw in this serious, book-loving boy the signs of a great future, and who encouraged that the boy's gifts be nurtured. This too is part of the story, and it reminds us of how often great lives depend on someone recognizing and encouraging a young person's gifts. The boy's own devotion was the essential thing, but it needed the chance to grow, the opportunity to study, the support to pursue the path that his heart desired, and that chance was given to him by a family willing to sacrifice, and by those who recognized his promise, so that the gifted boy from the humble town could set out, in time, toward the great city and the life of learning that awaited him. So we should hold this picture of his beginnings: an ordinary town, a modest family, a boy with no advantages but his own devotion, drawn from his earliest years toward knowledge and toward God, with an intensity beyond the ordinary. From such unremarkable soil grew one of the great scholars of the age. It is a reminder, as we follow his story, that what made him great was not where he came from, but what was within him, the love of knowledge and the devotion to God that he carried in his heart from the very beginning. Let us dwell longer on the great city that received him, and on the world of learning into which the young al-Nawawi stepped when he came to Damascus, for it was the soil in which his gifts came to full flower. Damascus in the 13th century was a marvel, an ancient city, one of the oldest in the world, layered with the history of many ages, and in this period a great center of the sacred sciences. Its streets were full of mosques and schools, its quarters home to scholars from many lands, its very air, one imagines, thick with learning and debate and devotion. For a young seeker of knowledge, it offered an abundance that must have been almost overwhelming. There were teachers in every science, masters of the law, of the traditions of the prophet, of the interpretation of scripture, of the Arabic language and its many branches, of the principles of belief. There were schools where students could live and study, libraries where the precious books were kept, study circles where the learned gathered to teach and to dispute. A devoted student could spend his days going from teacher to teacher, lesson to lesson, drinking from many wells, gathering knowledge from the finest minds of the age. It was, for such a student, a kind of paradise. And al-Nawawi made the fullest possible use of it. He studied, by the accounts, under a great many teachers, more than 20 masters of the various sciences. This was itself a remarkable thing, for to study under so many teachers required not only opportunity but extraordinary energy and dedication. Each teacher had his own knowledge to impart, his own chains of transmission reaching back through the generations, his own mastery of a particular science. By studying under so many, al-Nawawi gathered a breadth of learning that few could match, and he could cross-check what he learned, weighing one teacher's knowledge against another, building a deep and well-tested store of understanding. We can picture his days in those years of study, rising early, going from one lesson to the next, sitting at the feet of master after master, listening, memorizing, questioning, understanding. The accounts speak of him studying many lessons each day, in different sciences, a schedule of learning so intense that it seems scarcely possible. He would study the law in one circle, the traditions in another, the language in a third, the interpretation of scripture in a fourth, moving through the day from subject to subject, filling every hour with learning. It was a regime of study that would have exhausted most people, but al-Nawawi sustained it through his remarkable devotion and his disciplined use of time. His relationship with his teachers was one of deep respect and humility, as befitted a student of his tradition. To learn, in that world, was not merely to acquire information, but to enter into a relationship with one's teachers, to receive knowledge from them as a trust, to honor them as the bearers of a precious inheritance. Al-Nawawi honored his teachers deeply, and the bond between them was real. Years later, in his final days, it is said that he visited the graves of his teachers who had died, a poignant sign of how much these relationships had meant to him, how deeply he felt his debt to those who had taught him. And his teachers, for their part, recognized in him something extraordinary. A student of such devotion, such memory, such seriousness of purpose, could not but stand out, even among the many gifted students of a great city. They saw in him a young man destined for greatness, and they gave him their knowledge generously, perhaps sensing that it would bear remarkable fruit in him. The young man from the humble town, who had come to the city with nothing but his devotion, won the recognition and the affection of the great scholars of the age, who saw in him a worthy heir to the tradition they carried. It is worth pausing, too, on the role of the schools where he lived and studied, the places that housed and supported students of the sacred sciences. Al-Nawawi lived in one such school, called al-Rawahiyah, where, by the accounts, he lived in great simplicity, sustaining himself on little more than bread. These schools were one of the glories of the age, institutions devoted to the support of learning, where students could devote themselves to study without the need to earn a living, supported by the charity of those who valued knowledge. They made possible the intense, full-time devotion to learning that al-Nawawi exemplified, and they were a sign of how deeply that society valued the sacred sciences, that it would build and support institutions devoted entirely to their study. So we should picture al-Nawawi in these years as a student in a great city of learning, making the fullest use of its abundant treasures, studying under many masters, living in simplicity in a school devoted to knowledge, filling every hour with study, honored by his teachers as a young man of extraordinary promise. The humble boy from Nawa had found his element, the world of learning for which his soul had always longed, and in that world he was growing with remarkable speed into a master. As he grew from a brilliant student into a master in his own right, the qualities that would define al-Nawawi became ever clearer, and they are worth dwelling on, for they are the heart of what made him beloved, for he was not merely a learned man. There have been many learned men. What set al-Nawawi apart, and what has endeared him to generations, was the rare combination of his vast learning with a depth of piety, humility, and self-discipline that made him a model not only of knowledge but of how knowledge ought to be lived. Consider his simplicity, his austerity, his refusal of the comforts of the world. Throughout his life, even as he became famous and respected, he continued to live in the simplest way. He ate little and plainly. He wore simple clothes. He accumulated no wealth, sought no luxuries, surrounded himself with no comforts. He lived, in the midst of a great city, almost as a poor man, by deliberate choice. This was not because he could not have lived better, for his standing could have brought him comfort had he wished it. It was because he had decided, deep in his soul, that the comforts of the world were not worth the distraction they brought, that a life given to knowledge and to God was better lived simply, free of the entanglements that wealth and comfort create. He never married. This was unusual, and it was a deliberate choice, a reflection of how completely he had given himself to his work. He chose to devote the whole of his energy, the whole of his time, the whole of his life, to learning and teaching and writing and worship, without the responsibilities and divisions that family life would have brought. We need not see this as a rejection of family in itself, which his tradition honored, but as the particular choice of a particular man who felt called to give himself wholly and without reserve to his scholarly and spiritual mission. He had a sense, it seems, of how much there was to do, and perhaps some sense of how little time he would have to do it, and he poured everything into the work. His discipline in the use of time was extraordinary, and it is one of the things most often remembered about him. He seems to have regarded time as the most precious of all resources, not to be squandered. Every hour had its purpose, its lesson, its task. He divided his days among his many occupations, his studying, his teaching, his writing, his wording, his worship, allowing nothing to be wasted. The result of this discipline was a productivity that seems almost impossible when we remember how short his life was. In a span of only a few decades of scholarly life, he produced a body of work that would have been remarkable for a man who lived twice as long. The secret was not only his gifts but his discipline, his refusal to waste the time he was given. And yet, for all his discipline and his austerity, the accounts do not paint a picture of a harsh or forbidding man. Rather, they describe someone of deep humility and gentleness, kind to those around him, sincere in his devotion, free of the arrogance that learning so often breeds. He did not use his knowledge to lord it over others, nor to win fame and position for himself. He used it to serve, to teach, to guide, to benefit others. His humility was genuine, rooted in a real sense of his own smallness before God and of the seriousness of the knowledge he carried. He knew that learning was a trust, not a possession, and that it was to be used in service, not for self-glorification. A particular beauty lives in this combination of immense learning joined to genuine humility, of great discipline joined to real gentleness. Learning can so easily make a person proud, can become a means of feeling superior to others, of seeking status and admiration. Al-Nawawi's learning never did this to him. The more he knew, it seems, the humbler he became, the more aware of how much there was still to know, of how small any human knowledge is before the vastness of the divine. This humility is perhaps the most attractive of all his qualities, and it is part of why his works have been so beloved, for they carry the spirit of their author, a spirit of sincere devotion rather than self-display. We should also understand that his piety was not separate from his learning, but woven through it. For Al-Nawawi, the pursuit of knowledge was itself an act of worship, a way of drawing near to God. He did not study merely to know, but to live what he knew, to become better, to draw closer to the divine. His learning and his devotion were not two separate things but one, the knowledge feeding the devotion and the devotion giving purpose to the knowledge. This is why he is remembered not merely as a learned man but as a saintly one, a person in whom knowledge and piety had become perfectly joined. So we should picture him, in these years of his maturity, as a man of remarkable wholeness, vastly learned yet deeply humble, intensely disciplined yet genuinely gentle, austere in his way of life yet warm in his care for others, giving every hour of his short life to knowledge and to God. It is a rare and beautiful kind of life, and it was lived. Remember, against the backdrop of a dangerous and turbulent age, in a world shaken by invasion and fear. Amid all that turmoil, he built a life of quiet, disciplined, devoted scholarship, and from that life flowed gifts that would bless his faith for centuries. Let us try for a moment to picture the actual texture of his days, the lived reality of his devoted life, for the abstract praise of his discipline and piety can leave us with little sense of the man as he actually lived. What was it like to be Al-Nawawi, going about his ordinary days in 13th century Damascus? He would have risen early, in the dark hours before dawn, for the life of devotion begins with the night and the early morning, the quiet hours when the world sleeps and the soul can turn most fully toward God. He would have spent these hours in prayer and in the remembrance of God, in the quiet worship that was the foundation of his whole life. Then, as the day began, he would have turned to his studies and his teaching, going out into the city to the schools and the study circles, or receiving students who came to learn from him. His days, by all accounts, were filled to overflowing with purposeful activity. There was study, the constant deepening of his own knowledge. There was teaching, the passing on of that knowledge to his students. There was writing, the patient composition of the works that would outlast him. And there was worship, woven through it all, the prayers and devotions that kept his heart turned toward God. He moved through these occupations with the disciplined economy of a man who knew the value of time, allowing nothing to be wasted, filling each portion of the day with its proper work. And through all this purposeful activity ran the thread of his simplicity. He ate little and plainly, taking only what he needed to sustain his work. He wore simple clothes, sought no comforts, accumulated no possessions. His was not a life of ease and indulgence, punctuated by work, but a life of devoted labor, sustained by the simplest provision. There is an austerity in this that might seem severe, but we should remember that it was, for him, a chosen freedom, the lightness of a man unburdened by the endless needs that weigh most people down. We should not imagine, though, that his was a grim or joyless existence, for that would misread him. The accounts speak of his gentleness, his kindness, his care for others, qualities that do not belong to a sour or miserable soul. There was, surely, a deep joy in his life, the joy of a man doing exactly what he was made to do, giving himself to what he most loved, living in harmony with his deepest convictions. The joy of such a life is quieter than the pleasures the world offers, but it is deeper and more lasting, the contentment of a soul at peace with itself and its purpose. Al Nawawi seems to have possessed this quiet joy, this deep contentment, even amid his austerity and his labor. And we should picture, too, his relationships with the people around him, the students he taught, the fellow scholars he knew, the ordinary people he served and guided. For all his devotion to his solitary work of study and worship, he was not a hermit, cut off from human community. He was a teacher, surrounded by students, a scholar among scholars, a guide to ordinary believers who came to him for help. His gentleness and his care made him beloved by those who knew him, and his learning made him sought after by those who wished to learn. He lived, in the midst of his devotion, a life rich in human connection and service. This picture of his daily life, simple and devoted and full, helps us to understand the whole shape of his existence. It was a life stripped of the inessential, focused entirely on what mattered most, lived with discipline and devotion and a quiet, deep joy. And from this focused, devoted life flowed the remarkable productivity, the enduring works, the lasting influence. The simplicity was not incidental to his achievement, but essential to it. For it was the simplicity that freed him to give himself so fully to his work. He had pared his life down to its essence, and in that essence he found both his productivity and his peace. The simplicity of al-Nawawi's life, his austerity and his choice never to marry, deserve a deeper and more sympathetic understanding, for they are easily misunderstood, and they lie close to the heart of who he was. To our age, which prizes comfort and pleasure and the fullness of life's experiences, a life so stripped down, so devoted, so free of the ordinary comforts, might seem strange, even sad. But to understand al-Nawawi, we must try to see his choices as he saw them, not as deprivations but as liberations. Consider his austerity, his living on little more than bread, his refusal of the comforts that his standing could have brought him. We might be tempted to pity this, to see it as a hard and joyless existence, but that would be to miss what he found in it. For al-Nawawi, simplicity was not a burden but a freedom. The more a person needs, the more they are bound, anxious to acquire and afraid to lose. The fewer one's needs, the freer one becomes. By keeping his needs few, al-Nawawi freed himself from the endless pursuit of comfort and wealth that consumes so much of most people's lives and energy. He freed his time, his attention, his heart, for the things he truly valued: knowledge, worship, the service of his community. His austerity was the price of his freedom, and he paid it gladly. A deep wisdom lives in this, which our acquisitive age has largely forgotten. We tend to believe that the good life consists in having more, in accumulating comforts and pleasures and possessions. But there is another vision of the good life, ancient and wise, which holds that true freedom and contentment come not from having more but from needing less, that the person who has learned to be content with little is richer, in the ways that matter, than the person who is forever chasing more. Al-Nawawi embodied this older wisdom. He had learned to be content with very little, and in that contentment he found a freedom and a peace that no amount of comfort could have given him. His choice never to marry should be understood in the same light, as part of his complete devotion to his calling. In his tradition, marriage and family were honored and encouraged, and his choice to remain single was unusual, a reflection of how completely he felt called to give himself to his scholarly and spiritual work. He seems to have sensed that his mission required the whole of him, all his time and energy and devotion, without the divisions and responsibilities that family life would bring. And so he made the sacrifice, giving up the comforts and joys of family for the sake of the work he felt called to do. We need not see this as a rejection of family in itself, but as the particular choice of a man who felt called to a particular and demanding mission, and who gave up one good thing for the sake of another. And we should remember, when we consider these sacrifices, how much they yielded. Because al Nawawi kept his life simple and his time free, he was able to accomplish, in his short years, what most people could not accomplish in twice the time. The hours he did not spend pursuing wealth, the energy he did not spend on comfort, the attention he did not divide among family responsibilities, all of it was poured into his work, into study and teaching and writing and worship. His sacrifices were not losses but investments, and they yielded a return that has blessed his community for centuries. He gave up the lesser goods to gain the greater, and the wisdom of his choice is written in the enduring value of what he produced. His discipline in the use of time, especially, deserves our admiration and our reflection. He seems to have understood with unusual clarity that time is the most precious of all our possessions, the one thing that, once spent, can never be recovered, and he treated it accordingly, refusing to waste it, filling every hour with purpose, allowing nothing to slip away unspent. The famous image of him walking through the streets with a book in his hand, reading as he went, captures this perfectly. A man so aware of the value of time that he would not let even the minutes of a walk pass unused. Something almost startling lies in this intensity, this refusal to waste any portion of his brief life. And there is, perhaps, a poignancy in it as well, when we remember how short his life would be. He could not have known that he would die at 45, that his time would be so brief. But he lived as though every hour mattered, as though there was no time to waste, and in the event, there was not. Had he lived as most people live, letting the years drift by half-used, he would have left little behind. Because he lived with such intensity, such refusal to waste his days, he accomplished in a short life what others could not in a long one. There is a lesson here for all of us, who do not know how long our own time will be, that the way to be ready for a short life, or to make the most of a long one, is the same: to use well the time we are given, to waste none of it, to pour ourselves fully into what matters while we still can. To understand the heart of al Nawawi's scholarly achievement, we should understand the science to which he gave so much of his devotion, the science of the traditions of the Prophet, which his tradition calls the science of hadith. For though he was learned in many fields, in the law and the language and the interpretation of Scripture, it was as a master of the traditions that he achieved his greatest fame and made his most lasting contribution. The traditions of the Prophet were, and are, among the most precious treasures of his faith. They are the records of what the Prophet said and did, preserved and passed down through the generations, second only to the sacred Scripture itself as a source of guidance. To preserve these traditions faithfully, to distinguish the sound from the doubtful, to understand their meaning and to draw from them guidance for life, was one of the central tasks of the religious scholars, and a science of great sophistication had grown up around it over the centuries. This science demanded a rare combination of qualities. It required a vast memory, for the traditions were many, and each came with its chain of transmitters reaching back to the source. It required a critical and discerning mind, able to weigh the reliability of each chain, to judge whether the transmitters were trustworthy, to detect the signs that distinguished a sound tradition from a weak or fabricated one. And it required a deep understanding of the meaning of the traditions, of how they fit together, of what guidance they offered for the living of a good life. Al-Nawawi possessed all these qualities to a remarkable degree, and they made him one of the great masters of the science in his age. By the accounts, he was exceptionally rigorous in his standards, careful and exacting in his judgments about which traditions could be relied upon. He did not accept things carelessly, but applied strict criteria, weighing the evidence with the care of a judge. This rigor was essential to the integrity of his work, for the whole value of the science rested on its accuracy, on the careful distinction between the sound and the unsound. A scholar who was careless, who accepted doubtful traditions or rejected sound ones, would corrupt the very thing he was meant to preserve. Al-Nawawi's exacting care ensured that what he transmitted and what he wrote could be relied upon, and this reliability was one of the foundations of his lasting reputation. But al-Nawawi's genius was not only in the rigor of his scholarship, it was also, and perhaps especially, in his gift for making the treasures of the tradition accessible to ordinary people. Many scholars master a science and write for other scholars, in works so technical that only specialists can use them. Al-Nawawi did write such works, for he was a master capable of the most rigorous scholarship, but he also did something rarer and, in its way, more valuable. He gathered the treasures of the tradition and presented them in forms that ordinary believers could use, arranged by theme, focused on the practical guidance of daily life, written with a clarity and a warmth that made them accessible to all. This gift for accessibility, joined to his rigorous scholarship, is part of what made his work so beloved and so enduring. We can see, in this, the union of the scholar and the servant. Al-Nawawi was a scholar of the highest rank, capable of the most demanding technical work. But he did not use his learning merely to impress other scholars or to win a reputation among the learned. He used it to serve ordinary believers, to give them access to the treasures of their faith, to help them live good and righteous lives. His scholarship was always in the service of something larger than itself, the spiritual benefit of his community. And this selfless purpose, this orientation of all his learning toward the benefit of others, is part of what makes him not merely an impressive scholar but a beloved one. A lesson here reaches beyond his particular science. It is the lesson that the highest use of knowledge is not self-display but service, not the winning of reputation but the benefiting of others. Al-Nawawi could have used his vast learning to make himself famous among the learned, to win position and prestige. Instead, he used it to serve, to teach, to write works that would benefit ordinary people for centuries. And it is precisely this selfless use of his learning that has made his name beloved long after the names of more self-serving scholars have been forgotten. The knowledge that is given in service lasts, because it lives on in those it has served. From this disciplined and devoted life flowed a stream of written works that would become al-Nawawi's most enduring legacy, and it is to these that we must now turn, for they are the gift by which he is most widely known and loved. Despite the shortness of his life, he produced a remarkable number of books across many fields of the sacred sciences, and several of them became, and remain to this day, among the most widely read works in the whole of his tradition. Among the most beloved of these is a collection of the sayings of the Prophet that he gathered and arranged, a work whose title means something like the Gardens of the Righteous. In it, he collected hundreds upon hundreds of traditions, drawn from the most authentic sources, and arranged them by theme, gathering together the teachings on sincerity, on patience, on kindness, on truthfulness, on all the virtues and the manners that a believer should cultivate. What made this work so beloved was its accessibility and its purpose. It was not a dry technical work for specialists, but a practical guide to living a good and righteous life, accessible to ordinary believers, full of the gentle and ennobling teachings of their faith. For nearly 8 centuries it has been read in homes and mosques across the world, a companion to the daily lives of countless millions, and it remains, to this day, one of the most widely read books of its kind. He compiled, too, a smaller collection of 40 or so traditions, gathering together some of the most important and comprehensive teachings of the Prophet in a short and memorable form. This little collection became extraordinarily popular, memorized by students and ordinary believers alike, taught in schools across the world, a compact treasury of essential guidance that could be carried in the heart. Its very brevity was part of its genius, for it distilled the vast ocean of the tradition into a small and graspable form that anyone could learn. These were only two of his many works. He wrote a great commentary on one of the major collections of the Prophet's traditions, explaining and illuminating it with his vast learning. He wrote works on the law, guiding believers in the details of how to live according to their faith. He wrote on the remembrance of God, gathering the prayers and invocations of the tradition. He wrote on the proper manners of those who carry the sacred text, on biography, on the meanings of names and terms, and on much else besides. The range and the quantity of his output, achieved in so short a life, is genuinely astonishing, and it reflects the discipline and the devotion with which he used his brief time. What is most remarkable about his works, beyond their number, is their lasting quality. Many books are written in every age, and most are forgotten within a generation or two. But al-Nawawi's works have endured for nearly 800 years, still read, still taught, still loved, still central to the religious life of his community. This is a rare and remarkable thing, and it speaks to the quality of what he produced. The soundness of his learning, the clarity of his arrangement, the sincerity of his purpose, and the spirit of genuine devotion that breathes through his writing. He wrote not to display his learning, but to benefit others, and that selfless purpose is part of why his works have lived so long. Alongside his writing, he taught, and in time he came to hold a position of great honor among the scholars of Damascus. He became the head of one of the city's important schools devoted to the study of the Prophet's traditions, a position of real distinction, recognizing him as one of the foremost masters of that science in his age. From this position he taught and guided students, passing on the vast learning he had gathered, shaping the next generation of scholars. He had come to Damascus as a humble student from an unknown town, and he had risen, through nothing but his own devotion, to become one of its most honored teachers. But al-Nawawi was not only a scholar of books and lessons. He was also, when the moment demanded it, a man of remarkable courage, willing to stand before the most powerful ruler of his age and speak the truth in the cause of justice. This is one of the most striking aspects of his story, for it shows that his gentleness and humility were not weakness, but were joined to a deep moral strength. By the accounts, on more than one occasion he confronted the ruler of his time over matters of justice, refusing to flatter or to stay silent when he believed that wrong was being done to the people. It is even reported that the powerful ruler, who feared no army, said of this gentle scholar that he stood in awe of him, so great was the moral force of the man. We should tell this part of his story carefully, for our purpose is not to enter into the political disputes of that distant age, nor to take sides in quarrels long settled. What matters, for understanding the man, is the quality of soul it reveals. Here was a scholar of the utmost gentleness and humility, who lived simply and sought nothing for himself, and yet who would not be cowed by power, who would speak the truth to the mightiest ruler of his age when justice required it. His courage flowed from the same source as his humility, from his complete devotion to God, which freed him from the fear of any human power. A man who wants nothing from the world, and who fears only God, is a man who cannot be bought or frightened into silence. Al-Nawawi was such a man, and his quiet courage before the powerful is one of the noblest features of his story. It is worth dwelling longer on the two works for which al-Nawawi is most widely loved, for in them we can see, perhaps most clearly, the spirit of the man and the secret of his enduring influence. These were not his most technically advanced works, nor the ones that most displayed his scholarly powers. They were, rather, his most accessible and practical works, written not for scholars but for ordinary believers, and it is precisely this that has made them so beloved across the centuries. The first and greatest of these is his collection of the Prophet's sayings on the living of a righteous life. In it, he gathered hundreds upon hundreds of traditions, drawn from the most reliable sources, and arranged them by theme, so that a reader seeking guidance on any aspect of the good life could find, gathered in one place, what the tradition had to say. There were chapters on sincerity, on the purity of one's intentions before God. There were chapters on patience in the face of hardship, on gratitude for blessings, on trust in the divine. There were teachings on kindness to others, on honesty, on humility, on the controlling of anger, on the guarding of the tongue, on generosity to the poor, on the honoring of parents, on all the virtues and the manners that make up a life of goodness. What makes this collection so precious is its purpose and its spirit. It was designed, quite simply, to help people live better lives, to become better human beings and better servants of God. It is not concerned with abstract theory or technical dispute, but with the practical cultivation of virtue, with the daily business of living rightly. And it is suffused with a gentle, ennobling spirit, drawing the reader toward goodness not through fear or harshness, but through the beauty of the virtues it commends. To read it is to be gently encouraged toward a better way of living, to have one's better instincts strengthened, and one's heart turned toward the good. For nearly 800 years, this collection has been a companion to the lives of countless believers. It has been read in homes, taught in mosques, studied in schools, carried in hearts, across the whole of the Muslim world, and across all the centuries since al-Nawawi's death. It has guided the moral and spiritual lives of generation after generation, helping ordinary people to understand and to live the ethical teachings of their faith. Few books in any tradition can claim such enduring and widespread influence. And it flowed from the heart of a man who gave his short life to the service of others, who wanted nothing more than to help his fellow believers live well. His other most beloved work is even shorter, a collection of around 40 of the Prophet's most important and comprehensive sayings, gathered into a small and memorable form. The genius of this little collection lies in its brevity and its selection. From the vast ocean of the tradition, al-Nawawi chose a small number of sayings that, together, captured many of the most essential principles of the faith, the foundational teachings on which so much else rested. By gathering these into a short collection that could be easily memorized, he created a compact treasury of essential guidance, a kind of distillation of the tradition's core, that anyone could learn by heart and carry with them always. This little collection became one of the most widely memorized and taught texts in the entire tradition. Students across the world have committed it to memory. It has been explained in countless commentaries, taught in countless schools, learned by countless believers seeking to grasp the essentials of their faith in a graspable form. Its very smallness was part of its power, for it made the essential teachings accessible to everyone, not only to scholars with the time and training for longer works, but to ordinary people who could learn these 40 sayings and hold in their hearts a treasury of guidance. In both these works we see the same thing, a great scholar using his learning not to display his own brilliance but to serve ordinary people, to give them access to the treasures of their faith in forms they could use. This was al-Nawawi's particular genius, and his particular gift to his community. To be a master of the highest rank who nonetheless devoted himself to the practical spiritual benefit of ordinary believers. And it is why, of all his many works, it is these accessible, practical, ennobling collections that have been most beloved, for they reach directly into the daily lives and hearts of the people, offering guidance, comfort, and a gentle path toward the good. The scholar gave his learning to the people, and the people have cherished his gift for 800 years. The courage of al-Nawawi before the powerful deserves a closer and more thoughtful attention, for it reveals a dimension of his character that might otherwise be overlooked, and that adds a striking depth to the picture of the gentle, humble scholar. For it would be easy, from all we have said of his humility and his quiet devotion, to imagine him as a soft and retiring man, lost in his books, removed from the affairs of the world. But this would be a mistake. When justice was at stake, al-Nawawi could be as firm and fearless as he was, in ordinary times, gentle and humble. The accounts tell us that he stood before the ruler of his age, more than once, in the cause of justice, refusing to flatter the powerful or to stay silent in the face of wrong. When he believed that the people were being treated unjustly, that wrong was being done by those in power, he did not hold his tongue out of fear or self-interest. He spoke, plainly and firmly, calling the ruler to justice, even at the risk of his own safety. This was a dangerous thing to do, for rulers in that age held the power of life and death, and those who crossed them did so at their peril. But al-Nawawi was not deterred by the danger. He spoke the truth as he saw it, and let the consequences fall as they might. It is even reported that the powerful ruler, who commanded armies and feared no enemy, confessed to a kind of awe before this gentle scholar, acknowledging the moral force of the man. There is something remarkable in this image. The mighty ruler, with all his worldly power, standing in a kind of fear before the humble scholar who had no power but the power of truth and conscience. It reverses our usual sense of who is strong and who is weak. By every worldly measure, the ruler was powerful and the scholar was nothing. But there is another kind of power, the power of moral authority, of a conscience that cannot be bought or frightened, and in that power the humble scholar was stronger than the mighty ruler. We should understand where this courage came from, for it is instructive. It came from the same source as all the rest of his character, from his complete devotion to God and his freedom from the desires and fears of the world. A man who wants nothing from the world cannot be bribed, for there is nothing the world can offer him that he desires. A man who fears only God cannot be frightened by any human power, for the worst that a ruler can do is as nothing beside the one he truly fears. Al-Nawawi's austerity and his devotion, which we have already considered, were the foundation of his courage. Because he had freed himself from the love of comfort and the fear of loss, he was free to speak the truth without calculation, to stand for justice without fear. His simplicity and his courage were two fruits of the same root. We should tell this part of his story with care, for our purpose is not to enter into the political quarrels of that distant age, nor to take sides in disputes long since settled and forgotten. What matters for understanding the man is not the particular details of the disputes but the quality of soul they reveal. Here was a scholar of the utmost gentleness, who lived in simplicity and sought nothing for himself, and who yet possessed a moral courage that even the mightiest could not overawe. His gentleness was not weakness, and his humility was not servility. They were joined to a deep and fearless commitment to truth and justice, which is perhaps the rarest and most admirable combination of all. And this brings us to reflect once more on the brevity of his life and on what it teaches. For all of this, the learning, the writing, the teaching, the courage, the devotion, was accomplished in a life of only about 45 years. When we set the magnitude of what he achieved against the shortness of the time he was given, we are filled with a kind of wonder. How did one man, in so brief a span, accomplish so much? How did he write so many enduring works, master so many sciences, teach so many students, and still find time for the intense devotion and worship that marked his life? The answer lies in everything we have considered. In his discipline, his refusal to waste time, his simplicity that freed his energy, his complete devotion that held nothing back. He lived his short life with an intensity, a fullness, a refusal to waste, that allowed him to pack into 45 years what most people could not achieve in 80. And there is a profound lesson in this for all of us, who likewise do not know how long our own lives will be. It is that the measure of a life is not finally its length but its fullness, not how many years we are given, but how completely we use them. A long life, half-lived, may amount to little. A short life, fully lived, may bless the world for centuries. Al-Nawawi's brief and luminous life is the proof of it. It is worth dwelling on the sheer scale and endurance of Al-Nawawi's influence, for it is one of the most remarkable things about him. and it deserves to be felt fully rather than passed over quickly. Consider what it means for a person's works to remain in active, daily use for nearly 800 years. Most books, even good ones, even influential ones, fade within a generation or two, superseded by newer works, forgotten by all but specialists. To remain central, beloved, and widely read for 8 centuries is extraordinarily rare, a mark of a quality that transcends its age. Al-Nawawi's works have achieved this rare permanence. 800 years after his death, his collection of the Prophet's sayings on righteous living is still found in homes and mosques across the entire Muslim world. His little collection of 40 traditions is still memorized by students from one end of the earth to the other. His commentaries are still studied, his works on the law still consulted, his name still spoken with love and reverence wherever his faith is found. The humble scholar from the obscure town of Nawa has become one of the most widely read authors in the history of his civilization, his words a living presence in the daily religious lives of hundreds of millions of people across the centuries. Think of the reach of this influence across space as well as time. From Damascus, where he wrote, his works spread outward to every land where his faith took root, west across North Africa, south into the heart of Africa, south into the heart of Africa, east into Persia and India and the lands beyond, into the distant islands of the southeast, wherever believers gathered to learn their faith. In all these lands, across all these centuries, people have opened al-Nawawi's books and found in them guidance, comfort, and a gentle path toward the good. A boy from a small Syrian town in the 13th century has shaped the moral and spiritual lives of countless people in lands he never saw and ages he could never have imagined. And we should consider why his works, in particular, have endured so remarkably when so many others have been forgotten. Part of the answer lies in their soundness, the rigorous scholarship that underlay them, which meant they could be relied upon and did not need to be discarded as flawed. Part lies in their accessibility, the way he made the treasures of the tradition available to ordinary people in clear and usable forms. And part lies, surely, in their spirit, the sincere devotion that breathes through them, the sense the reader has of being in the presence of a genuinely good and pious man who wanted nothing but their benefit. Works written for self-display do not last in this way. Works written in sincere service to others have a life that endures, because they continue to serve, generation after generation. In all this lies a striking illustration of a deep truth about influence and legacy. Al-Nawawi sought no fame, no power, no worldly greatness. He lived simply, humbly, in devotion to God and service to others, and he died young, in the obscure town where he was born, without ever having held worldly power or accumulated worldly wealth. By the measures of the world, he was a small figure, a poor scholar of no rank or riches, and yet his influence has outlasted that of the mighty rulers of his age, the sultans and conquerors whose names are now known only to historians. The gentle scholar who sought nothing for himself has shaped the world more deeply and more lastingly than the powerful men who sought everything. This is the quiet triumph of a life given to what truly lasts. The powers and glories of the world pass away, as they always do. The empires fall, the conquerors are forgotten, the worldly achievements crumble into dust. But a life given to knowledge, to goodness, to the sincere service of others, can leave a mark that endures across centuries, can continue to bless the world long after the powers of its age have vanished. Al-Nawawi understood, it seems, where true and lasting value lay, and he gave his short life to it, and the enduring power of his legacy is the vindication of his choice. He chose the lasting over the passing, the eternal over the temporary, and his choice has been rewarded with an influence that has lasted, and will likely continue to last, for as long as his faith endures. As we draw near the close of his story, It is worth pausing to reflect on the deeper meaning of the way he held his knowledge, for in it lies a wisdom that speaks to anyone, of any time or faith, who seeks to live well. Al-Nawawi was, above all, a man of knowledge, and the way he related to that knowledge tells us much about the kind of soul he was. There is a way of holding knowledge that puffs a person up, that makes them proud, that becomes a means of feeling superior to others, and of seeking admiration and status. We have all encountered this, the learning that serves the ego, the knowledge worn as an ornament of pride. It is one of the great dangers of the learned life, perhaps the greatest, for knowledge so easily becomes a source of vanity, and the more a person knows, the more tempted they may be to look down on those who know less. Many learned people have fallen into this trap, and their learning, however great, has made them smaller, rather than larger as human beings. Al-Nawawi held his knowledge in the opposite way. The more he learned, the humbler he seems to have become. His vast learning did not puff him up but deepened his sense of his own smallness before the immensity of what there was to know, and before the greatness of God. He understood that knowledge was a trust, not a possession, something given to be used in service, not owned to be displayed. And so his learning made him not proud but humble, not grasping but giving, not superior but devoted. This is the rarest and most beautiful way to hold knowledge, and it is part of what made him not merely a great scholar but a great soul. The secret of this, it seems, was that for al-Nawawi knowledge was never separate from devotion. He did not pursue knowledge for its own sake, nor for the sake of reputation, but as a way of drawing near to God and of serving God's creatures. His learning was, from beginning to end, an act of worship, a form of devotion woven through with the love of God. And knowledge held in this way cannot become a source of pride, for it is always oriented beyond the self, toward God and toward others. The scholar who studies to draw near to God and to serve others is protected from the vanity of learning, because his knowledge is never about himself. There is a lesson in this for all of us, whatever knowledge or skills or gifts we may possess. It is that the value of what we know, or what we can do, lies not in how it elevates us above others, but in how it allows us to serve. Our gifts, whatever they are trusts, given to be used for good, not possessions to be displayed for our own glory. And held in this way, in humility and in the spirit of service, our gifts make us larger, deepen us, draw us closer to others, and to what is good. Held in the other way, as ornaments of pride, they make us smaller, however great they are. Al-Nawawi's life is a quiet, powerful lesson in the right way to hold our gifts. And there is, finally, a deep peace in the kind of life he lived, the life of devoted service, that is worth feeling as the night deepens. For there is a restlessness that comes from living for oneself, from the endless pursuit of one's own advancement, comfort, and glory, a restlessness that is never satisfied, because the self can never be filled. And there is a peace that comes from living for something beyond oneself, from giving oneself to a worthy purpose, from spending one's life in service rather than in self-seeking. Al-Nawawi seems to have found this peace, the peace of a life that is not at war with itself, that is given wholly to what it loves and values. In his simplicity, his devotion, his service, he found a contentment that all the comforts and glories of the world could not have given him. To contemplate such a life, as sleep draws near, is itself a kind of rest. It quiets the restless striving that fills so much of our waking hours, the endless pursuit of more, the anxious comparison of ourselves with others. It reminds us that there is another way to live, a way of simplicity, of devotion, of service, that brings a peace the world cannot give. We need not live exactly as Al-Nawawi lived, for his was a particular calling, suited to a particular man. But we can carry something of his spirit into our own lives, the spirit of holding our gifts in humility, of giving ourselves to what truly matters, of seeking the peace that comes not from getting, but from giving. And in that spirit we may find a measure of the rest that he found, a quieting of the restless heart, a peace that goes deeper than sleep. And so the years of his short life passed, filled to overflowing with study and teaching and writing and worship, until the time came, far too soon, for that life to end. For al-Nawawi would not live to old age. He would not have the long span that many scholars are granted to complete their work and see their influence grow. His life would be brief, and its ending would come quietly, in the humble town where it had begun. In his final period, after years of intense labor in Damascus, he returned to his hometown of Nawa. By the accounts, he had returned the books he had borrowed, visited the graves of his teachers who had passed before him, and set his affairs in order, almost as though he sensed that his time was drawing near. He went to visit his parents in the town of his birth, and there, in Nawa, he fell ill. His illness grew worse, and in the year 1277, in the town where he had been born, Imam al Nawawi died. He was only about 45 years old. Let us pause to feel the weight of that. 45 years. It is not a long life. Many people are only reaching the fullness of their powers at such an age, with decades of work still ahead of them. Al-Nawawi had already done the work of several lifetimes, had already written the books that would bless his community for centuries, and then he was gone, while still, by the measure of years, a relatively young man. There is something poignant in this, in the brevity of a life that gave so much. We cannot help but wonder what more he might have written, what more he might have taught, had he been granted the long life that others receive. But we should also see the other truth, that he had not wasted a single one of the years he was given, and that a short life, fully lived, can accomplish more than a long life half spent. There is something quietly affecting in the accounts of his final acts, in the way he seemed to set his affairs in order as his end approached, almost as though he sensed it coming. By the reports he returned the books that he had borrowed, those precious volumes that had been the companions of his studies, giving them back to their owners. He visited the graves of his teachers, the masters who had given him his knowledge and who had gone before him into death, paying his last respects to those to whom he owed so much. And then he went home, to the town of his birth, to visit his parents, returning at the end to the place where his life had begun. There is a gentle completeness in these final acts, a sense of a man quietly closing the circle of his life, settling his debts, honoring his teachers, returning to his roots. Whether or not he consciously knew that his end was near, he met it as he had lived, with order, with gratitude, with devotion, leaving nothing undone and no debt unpaid. And in the gentleness of that ending there is a kind of peace, the peace of a life completed, a journey finished, a soul ready to return to the God it had served. He had given everything he had to give, had held nothing back, had wasted nothing. And so, when the end came, there was a fittingness to it, the fittingness of a task completed, a life fully spent in the service of what it loved. We will not invent the scene of his passing, nor adorn it with marvels, for the simple truth is dignified enough. A man who had given the whole of his brief life to knowledge and to God came quietly to the end of it, in the humble town where he had been born, among his own people. He was buried there, in Nawa, and his grave became, and remains, a place that people visit and honor. In memory of the great scholar who had come from that modest town, we mention this gently and with respect, as the simple fact of how he has been remembered, for our story is of his life rather than of the honors paid after his death. But though his life was short, his influence has been vast and lasting, far beyond anything the brief span of his years might suggest. For the works he left behind did not die with him. They lived on, and spread, and grew in influence across the centuries. His collection of the Prophet's sayings on righteous living became a beloved companion in homes and mosques across the entire Muslim world. His little collection of 40 traditions became one of the most memorized and taught texts in the whole of his faith. His commentaries and his works on the law became foundational, studied by scholars and students for generations. 800 years after his death, his name is known and loved wherever his faith is found, and his works are still read every day by countless people. The humble scholar from the unknown town has become one of the most influential teachers in the history of his tradition. And here we begin to see the deepest meaning of his life, the thing that makes it endure beyond all the particulars of his works. His life is a powerful demonstration of how much a single person can give, even in a short time, when they devote themselves completely to something worthy. He had no advantages of birth or wealth. He had no long life in which to work. He had only his own devotion, his own discipline, his own refusal to waste the precious gift of his days. And with these alone, in a span of only a few decades, he produced a legacy that has blessed hundreds of millions of people across nearly 8 centuries. It is a staggering thing, when we truly consider it, and it stands as a witness to the power of a life given wholly to a worthy purpose. A lesson in this reaches far beyond his particular life and time, and that speaks to each of us, whatever our own circumstances. We often suppose that to do something great, we need advantages, long years, favorable conditions. Al-Nawawi's life suggests otherwise. It suggests that what matters most is not how long we live, nor what advantages we begin with, but how completely we give ourselves to what we love, how little of our time we waste, how fully we pour ourselves into our work. He gave everything, held nothing back, wasted nothing. And from a short life lived without advantages he produced gifts that have lasted for centuries. We need not match his particular achievements, but we can learn from the spirit of his life, the spirit of giving ourselves fully, of not wasting our days, of pouring what we have into what matters most. Let us reflect more deeply on the discipline of time that so marked al-Nawawi's life, for it is one of the most striking and instructive features of his story, and it speaks directly to our own age. We have noted his famous devotion to learning, his studying of many lessons each day, his refusal to waste even the minutes of a walk. But it is worth dwelling on what lay beneath this, on the understanding of time that drove such intense devotion. Al-Nawawi seems to have grasped, with unusual clarity, a truth that most of us know in theory, but rarely live by. That time is the most precious of all our possessions, the one resource that, once spent, can never be recovered. We can lose wealth and regain it, lose health and recover it, lose a position and find another. But time, once past, is gone forever. Each hour that slips away unused is lost beyond recovery, and the sum of our hours, the span of our lives, is limited and uncertain, a finite and precious allotment whose end we cannot foresee. To grasp this truly, as al-Nawawi seems to have grasped it, is to be unable to waste time carelessly, to feel the value of each passing hour, to be moved to fill one's days with what truly matters. This understanding gave his life its remarkable intensity, its refusal to waste the precious gift of his days. He did not let his hours drift away in idleness or trivial diversion. He filled them with study, with teaching, with writing, with worship, with the things he judged most worthy of his limited and precious time. And the result, as we have seen, was a productivity that seems almost impossible when we remember how short his life was. He accomplished in 45 years what most could not accomplish in 80, because he wasted so little of the time he was given, because he lived each hour with a sense of its value. There is a profound challenge in this for us, who live in an age of unprecedented distraction, surrounded by endless ways to waste our time. We have perhaps more leisure than any generation before us, and more ways to fill it with things that do not matter, that leave us neither wiser nor better nor closer to anything we truly value. Al-Nawawi's example calls us to examine how we spend our days, to ask whether we are filling our precious and limited time with what truly matters, or letting it slip away on trivial distractions that leave us empty. It is an uncomfortable question, but a valuable one, and his life poses it to us with particular force. We should be careful, though, not to misunderstand his intensity as a grim or joyless thing, a mere anxious busyness, for his use of time was not driven by anxiety but by love, by his deep love for knowledge and for God, and by his sense of the preciousness of the opportunity to serve them. He filled his time not with frantic activity, but with the things he loved most, the study and teaching and worship that were his deepest joys. His intensity was the intensity of love, of a man so devoted to what he valued that he could not bear to waste the time he might give to it. There is a kind of joy in such intensity, the joy of a life fully given to what one loves. And we should not imagine al Nawawi as a joyless workaholic, but as a man filled with the deep satisfaction of a life poured out for what he treasured. And there is, in his disciplined use of time, a kind of reverence, a treating of time as a sacred trust. For if our time is a gift given to us by God for a purpose, then to waste it is a kind of ingratitude, a squandering of what has been entrusted to us. And to use it well, to fill it with what is worthy, is a kind of gratitude, a faithful stewardship of the precious gift we have been given. Al-Nawawi seems to have regarded his time in this way, as a sacred trust to be used faithfully, and this reverence for time was part of his broader reverence for all the gifts of God, his sense that life itself was a trust to be lived faithfully in service of its giver. We might take from his example, then, not an anxious resolve to be constantly busy, but a deeper reverence for the gift of our time, a resolve to use it more faithfully, to fill it more fully with what truly matters. We need not match his particular intensity, for his was a particular calling, but we can learn to value our time as he valued his, to waste less of it on what does not matter, to fill more of it with what we truly love and value. In this, the disciplined scholar of Damascus can be our teacher, reminding us, across the centuries, of the preciousness of the time we are given, and of the importance of using it well. Let us turn now to consider more deeply the courage that al-Nawawi showed before the powerful, for it reveals a dimension of his character that adds great depth to the picture of the gentle, devoted scholar, and it deserves fuller exploration. We have noted that he stood before the ruler of his age in the cause of justice, refusing to flatter or stay silent when wrong was being done. But it is worth understanding what this courage cost, and where it came from, and what it teaches us. In the world of his age, to confront a powerful ruler was no small thing. The rulers held the power of life and death, and those who crossed them risked their positions, their freedom, even their lives. A scholar who confronted a ruler over matters of justice was taking a real risk, putting himself in genuine danger for the sake of his principles. Many scholars, understandably, chose discretion, kept their heads down, avoided confrontation with the powerful. There was no shame in this, for the dangers were real and the temptation to safety strong. But al-Nawawi chose otherwise. When justice demanded it, he spoke, regardless of the risk to himself. This courage is all the more striking when we remember the gentleness and humility that otherwise marked his character. He was not a combative or aggressive man, not one who sought out confrontation or relished conflict. He was, by all accounts, gentle, humble, devoted to his quiet scholarly life. And yet, when justice was at stake, this gentle man became firm and fearless, willing to confront the mightiest ruler of his age. This combination of gentleness in ordinary matters and firmness in matters of principle is the mark of a truly strong character, one whose gentleness is not weakness and whose firmness is not aggression, but both of which flow from a deep inner strength and integrity. And where did this courage come from? It came, as we have noted, from his complete devotion to God and his freedom from the desires and fears of the world. A man who wants nothing from the world cannot be bought. A man who fears only God cannot be frightened by any human power. Al-Nawawi's simplicity and his devotion, which freed him from the love of comfort and the fear of loss, were the foundation of his courage. Because he had freed himself from worldly attachments, he was free to speak the truth without calculation, to stand for justice without fear of the consequences. His courage was the fruit of his detachment, his freedom from the world the source of his fearlessness before the powerful. It is worth dwelling on the practical wisdom of his most beloved works, for it reveals something important about the kind of scholar he was, and the kind of good he sought to do. We have noted that his most cherished works were not his most technically advanced, but his most practical and accessible, the ones aimed at helping ordinary believers live good and righteous lives. This was no accident, but reflected a deep choice about the purpose of his scholarship. For al-Nawawi could have devoted himself entirely to the most advanced and technical scholarship, writing works that only specialists could use, winning a reputation among the learned for his mastery of difficult questions. He had the ability for this, and he did produce works of high technical scholarship. But he chose also, and especially, to produce works for ordinary people, works that would help them in the living of their daily lives, that would guide them in virtue and devotion, that would bring the treasures of their faith within reach of all. This choice reflected a deep humility and a genuine love for ordinary believers, a desire to serve not only the learned few but the many. His collection of the Prophet's sayings on righteous living is the great example of this. It is a work of profound practical wisdom, gathering the teachings of the tradition on all the virtues and the manners that make up a good life, arranged so that anyone seeking guidance could find it. It teaches sincerity, patience, gratitude, kindness, honesty, humility, the controlling of anger, the guarding of the tongue, generosity, the honoring of parents, and all the other virtues of a good and righteous life. And it teaches these not in abstract theory, but in the concrete, practical form of the Prophet's own sayings, gathered and arranged for the guidance of daily life. A deep wisdom lives in this focus on the practical, on the actual living of a good life. For knowledge, however vast, is of little value if it does not issue in good living, if it remains merely theoretical, disconnected from how we actually conduct ourselves. The purpose of religious knowledge, in al-Nawawi's understanding, was not merely to know but to live well, to become better human beings and better servants of God. And so he focused his most beloved works on the practical cultivation of virtue, on the actual business of living rightly, knowing that this was the true purpose of all the learning he had gathered. We can see, in this, the union of knowledge and life that marked his whole approach. For al-Nawawi, knowledge was always in the service of life, of good living, of the cultivation of virtue and devotion. He did not pursue knowledge for its own sake, as a mere intellectual exercise, nor for the sake of reputation among the learned. He pursued it in order to live well and to help others live well, to translate the teachings of his faith into the actual conduct of daily life. And his most beloved works reflect this purpose, gathering the practical wisdom of the tradition for the guidance of ordinary lives. A lesson waits here for us about the proper relationship between knowledge and life. We can accumulate knowledge endlessly, can know a great deal about many things, and yet remain unchanged by it, no better, no wiser, no closer to living well. The value of knowledge lies finally in what it does to us, in how it shapes our living, in whether it makes us better human beings. Al-Nawawi understood this, and oriented his learning toward life, toward the actual cultivation of virtue and devotion. His example calls us to do the same, to let our knowledge issue in better living, to seek not merely to know but to become, through what we know, better than we were. Let us consider, too, the enduring relevance of the virtues that his great work teaches, for they are not bound to any age but belong to the human condition itself. Sincerity, patience, gratitude, kindness, honesty, humility, the controlling of anger, generosity, these are virtues that every age needs, that every human life is better for cultivating. The particular circumstances of life change across the centuries, but the virtues that make a good human life remain constant. And so al Nawawi's collection of teachings on these virtues remains as relevant now as when he compiled it, as useful to a person seeking to live well today as to one in 13th century Damascus. This is part of why the work has endured so remarkably, read and treasured for nearly 800 years. It speaks to something permanent in the human condition, the perennial need to cultivate the virtues that make a good life. And it speaks to this need with a wisdom drawn from the deepest sources of his tradition, presented with a clarity and an accessibility that has made it useful to countless people across the centuries. The virtues it teaches do not go out of date, and so the work that teaches them remains perpetually fresh, perpetually useful, a companion to the moral life of generation after generation. We might reflect, finally, on what it means that a scholar's greatest legacy should be a work of practical moral guidance, a help to ordinary people in living good lives. For this tells us something about what truly endures, about what is finally most valuable. The technical achievements of scholarship, impressive as they are, often fade in importance as knowledge advances and new works supersede the old. But a work that helps people live well, that guides them in virtue and devotion, has a more lasting value, for the need it meets is permanent, rooted in the unchanging human condition. Al-Nawawi's greatest legacy is precisely such a work, and its enduring life across the centuries testifies to the lasting value of practical wisdom in the service of good living. Let us reflect more deeply on the meaning of Al-Nawawi's simplicity and his choice never to marry, for these aspects of his life, which might seem strange or even troubling to us, hold a wisdom worth understanding. We live in an age that prizes comfort, pleasure, and the fullness of experience, and a life so stripped down, so devoted, so free of the ordinary comforts and relationships, might seem to us a kind of deprivation, even a loss. But to understand Al-Nawawi, we must try to see these choices as he saw them, not as deprivations but as the necessary conditions of a particular calling. His simplicity, his living on little, his refusal of comforts, freed him for his work. Every comfort we acquire brings with it a kind of bondage, the need to maintain it, the fear of losing it, the time and energy required to sustain it. By keeping his life simple, Al-Nawawi freed himself from these bondages, freed his time and energy and attention for the things he valued most. His simplicity was not a deprivation, but a liberation, a freeing of himself from the entanglements that comfort brings, so that he could give himself wholly to his learning and his devotion. And his choice never to marry should be understood in the same way, as part of his complete devotion to his calling. In his tradition, marriage was honored and encouraged, a normal and blessed part of life, and his choice to remain single was unusual. But it was, for him, the necessary condition of the particular mission he felt called to, which required the whole of his time and energy and devotion, without the responsibilities and divisions that family life would bring. He gave up one good thing, the joys and comforts of family, for the sake of another, his complete devotion to learning and teaching and worship. It was a sacrifice, freely chosen, for the sake of a calling he felt deeply. We should be careful not to generalize from his particular choice, as though it were a model for all, for it was not. His tradition honored marriage and family, and most of the great scholars of his faith married and had families. Al-Nawawi's celibacy was the particular choice of a particular man with a particular sense of his calling, not a general rule or an ideal for all to follow. But it reveals the depth of his devotion, the completeness with which he gave himself to his mission, the willingness to sacrifice even the normal goods of life for the sake of what he felt called to do. And in this completeness of devotion, even if not in the particular form it took, there is something we can admire and learn from. For the deeper principle beneath his particular choices is one that applies to all of us. That great achievements require sacrifice, the giving up of lesser goods for the sake of greater ones, the focusing of our limited time and energy on what we judge most worthy. We cannot do everything, cannot have everything, cannot give ourselves fully to many things at once. To accomplish something great, we must choose, must focus, must sacrifice the many possible goods we might pursue for the sake of the few we judge most worthy. Al Nawawi made this choice with unusual completeness, sacrificing much for the sake of his calling, and the greatness of what he accomplished was, in part, the fruit of this willingness to sacrifice. A challenge waits in this for us, who often wish to have everything, to pursue every good, to avoid all sacrifice. Al Nawawi's life reminds us that the greatest achievements require focus and sacrifice, the willingness to give up lesser goods for greater ones. We need not match his particular sacrifices, his celibacy, or his extreme simplicity, but we can learn from the principle they embody, the recognition that to accomplish something worthy, we must focus our limited energies, must choose what matters most and give ourselves to it, must be willing to sacrifice the many things we might do for the sake of the few we judge most worthy of our brief and precious lives. Let us consider, as well, the relationship between al-Nawawi's piety and his learning, for in him the two were perfectly joined, and this union is one of the most beautiful features of his life. He was not merely a learned man who happened also to be pious, nor a pious man who happened also to be learned. In him, learning and piety were one, woven together into a single devotion. His learning was a form of worship, his study a way of drawing near to God, and his piety informed and elevated his learning, giving it purpose and direction. The two were not separate compartments of his life, but a single, integrated whole. This union of learning and piety is the ideal of his tradition, which has always held that knowledge and devotion belong together, that the purpose of religious learning is not merely to know, but to draw near to God, and to live well. Al-Nawawi embodied this ideal as fully as anyone, a scholar whose vast learning was entirely in the service of his devotion, whose every study was a form of worship, whose knowledge made him not proud but humble, not worldly but devout. In him, the danger of learning, that it can puff up and corrupt, was entirely overcome, for his learning was wholly subordinated to his devotion, wholly in the service of God. And there is a deep beauty in this integrated life, this wholeness in which learning and piety, knowledge and devotion, study and worship were all one. For there is a kind of fragmentation that afflicts many lives, a disconnection between the different parts, the work and the faith, the knowledge and the living, the outer and the inner. Al-Nawawi's life was free of this fragmentation, integrated and whole, every part serving the same devotion, all of it one. And in this wholeness there is a deep peace, the peace of a life that is not divided against itself but unified in a single purpose, given wholly to a single love. It is a wholeness we might aspire to in our own lives, the integration of our knowledge and our living, our work and our deepest values into a single unified whole. Let us return for a while to the great city that shaped him, and to the remarkable community of learning in which he lived, for understanding this world helps us to see his achievement more clearly. Damascus in the 13th century was, as we have said, one of the foremost centers of learning in the world, a city full of scholars and schools, drawing students from many lands. To live and study there was to be part of a vibrant community of the learned, bound together by their shared devotion to knowledge. Within this community, al-Nawawi rose to a position of great honor, becoming the head of one of its important schools devoted to the study of the traditions of the Prophet. This was a significant distinction, a recognition of his mastery of that science and his standing among the scholars of the city. From this position he taught and guided students, shaping the next generation of scholars, passing on the vast learning he had gathered. He had come to the city as a humble student from an unknown town, and he had risen, through nothing but his own devotion and gifts, to become one of its honored teachers. We can imagine the texture of his life within this community of learning, the lessons he taught, the students who gathered around him, the fellow scholars with whom he studied and discussed and debated, the rich intellectual life of a great center of knowledge. It was a demanding and a rewarding life, full of the exchange and the labor that the pursuit of knowledge required. And through it all, al-Nawawi maintained his characteristic simplicity and devotion, never using his standing for personal advantage, never letting the honors he received corrupt his sincerity. Something worth noting marks the way he held his position of honor, for it reveals his character. Many who rise to positions of distinction are changed by them, made proud or self-important, absorbed in their own status. Al-Nawawi was not. He held his position as a trust, a means of serving the knowledge he loved and the community he belonged to, not as a personal achievement to be enjoyed for its own sake. The honor came to him because of his learning and his character, not because he sought it, and he held it with the same humility and devotion that marked all his life. His standing did not corrupt him, because he had not sought it for his own glory, but received it as a means of greater service. And his role as a teacher deserves particular attention, for teaching was at the center of his life's work, alongside his writing. To teach is to give, to pass on what one has received, to shape the minds and souls of those who come to learn. Al-Nawawi gave himself to this work with devotion, sharing the vast learning he had gathered, guiding his students in the sacred sciences, shaping the next generation of scholars. And his teaching, like his writing, was marked by sincerity and by a genuine concern for the benefit of those he taught, not for his own reputation or advantage. A particular nobility marks the work of the teacher, in the patient passing on of knowledge to those who come after, and al-Nawawi embodied it fully. Through his teaching, his learning lived on, not only in his writings but in the minds and souls of his students, who carried forward what they had received from him. The teacher's influence is quiet and often unseen, working through the lives of those they teach, but it is among the most lasting and important of all influences. Al-Nawawi was a teacher in this deep sense, shaping not only the knowledge but the character of those who learned from him, passing on not only facts but a whole way of relating to knowledge, marked by rigor, sincerity, and devotion. Let us also reflect on the remarkable fact of his productivity, on how a man who lived only 45 years could produce so vast a body of work. We have touched on this, but it is worth dwelling on, for it is genuinely astonishing. In a span of only a few decades of scholarly life, al-Nawawi produced numerous works across many fields, several of which became foundational and enduring. This was the output of a man who lived twice his span, achieved in less than half the time. How was it possible? The answer lies in everything we have considered: his remarkable gifts, his prodigious memory, his deep learning, but above all his discipline and his devotion, his refusal to waste the precious time he was given. He filled his days with purposeful work, wasted little, gave himself wholly to his learning and his writing and his teaching, and the result was a productivity that seems almost superhuman, the fruit of a life lived with extraordinary intensity and focus. He poured the whole of himself into his work, held nothing back, wasted nothing, and so accomplished, in his brief life, what most could not in a long one. A deep encouragement waits in this for any of us who feel that we lack the time to accomplish what we hope, that our days are too few or too crowded for the things we wish to do. Al-Nawawi's life shows what is possible when we use our time with discipline and devotion, when we waste little and focus on what matters most. He did not have a long life, nor unlimited time. He had a short life, like all of us, and he made of it something extraordinary, through the disciplined and devoted use of the time he was given. His example calls us to do the same, to make the most of our own brief and precious time, to accomplish what we can in the span we are given, without wasting it or letting it slip away. We should remember, too, that all this productivity was in the service of others, not of his own glory. He wrote not to make himself famous but to benefit his community, to help people understand their faith and live good lives. His vast output was a vast gift, poured out for the benefit of others, and it is this selfless purpose that has given his works their enduring life. Works written for self-glory tend to die with their authors. Works written in genuine service to others have a life that endures, because they continue to serve. Al-Nawawi's works were written in service, and they have served, and continue to serve for nearly 800 years. As we prepare to let his story rest, let us hold once more the central image of his life, the image that has endeared him to generations. A young scholar walking the streets of Damascus with a book in his hand, reading as he went, unwilling to waste a single hour of his brief and precious time. There is, in this image, something that speaks to the deepest part of us, the recognition of a life lived with complete devotion, poured out wholly for what it loved, wasting nothing of the gift of its days. For we know, in our hearts, how easily life slips away, how the days and the years pass, how much of our time drifts by unused, spent on things that do not finally matter. And we sense, in al-Nawawi's intense devotion, a rebuke to our own wastefulness, but also an inspiration, a glimpse of what a life can be when it is given wholly to what it values, when it refuses to waste the precious time it is granted. He shows us that a life, even a short one, can be filled to overflowing with meaning and accomplishment, if only we will give ourselves to it as he gave himself. And there is, in the contemplation of his life, a quiet challenge to examine our own, to ask whether we are using our time as he used his, whether we are giving ourselves to what truly matters, whether we are pouring our lives into what we most value or letting them slip away unspent. It is a gentle challenge, not a harsh one, an invitation rather than a reproach. But it is real, and it is valuable, and it is one of the gifts his life offers us across the centuries, the invitation to live more fully, more devotedly, more deliberately, to make the most of the brief and precious time we are each given. So as the night deepens and your own day draws to its close, you might carry with you a little of his spirit, his sense of the preciousness of time, his devotion to what he loved, not as a burden, not as an anxious resolve to be constantly busy, but as a gentle reminder of the value of your own days, an encouragement to give yourself, in your own way and your own measure, to what you most truly love and value. The scholar who walked the streets with a book in his hand, unwilling to waste an hour, has finished his own brief and luminous life, and his example remains across the centuries, a quiet light, showing us what a life can be when it is given wholly to what it loves. There is no greater tribute we can pay to such a life than to let it inspire our own, to take from it not only admiration, but a gentle resolve to live a little more as he lived, with devotion, with focus, with a deep sense of the value of our time and the importance of giving it to what truly matters. In this, the humble scholar from the town of Nawa continues to teach us, across nearly 800 years, and his quiet life of devotion continues to bear fruit in the lives of those who learn from it. And here we return, at the last, to the quiet question his life poses to each of us who hears it. Our own time, like his, is brief, briefer than we like to think. We do not know how many years we will be given. The question his life asks is simply this: are we using the time we have, as he used his, by giving ourselves fully to what we most love and value, or are we letting our days slip away, unspent, on things that do not finally matter? He did not waste his short life. He poured it out completely, and left behind something that has lasted for centuries. His life asks us, gently, what we are doing with our own. There is no need to answer that question tonight. Some questions are not meant to be solved quickly, but to be carried gently, turned over slowly, lived with over a long while. Let it rest beside you now, softly, asking nothing of you but a moment's quiet reflection. The scholar who gave his whole brief life to knowledge and died young, having given so much, has finished his short and luminous journey, and you have followed it gently all the way to its peaceful end. So let your thoughts grow still. Let the humble town of Nawa fade into the dark, and the great city of Damascus with its schools and its scholars, and the young man walking its streets with a book in his hand, unwilling to waste a single hour. Let the names and the dates drift away, for they have done their work. What remains is only the quiet and the question, and the calm of the gathering night. May your mind grow easy, may your heart be untroubled, and may your rest tonight be deep and peaceful and kind.